The Iraqi city of Mosul, the humanitarian situation is worsening as the US-led anti-terror operation unfolds. We've just received the following footage. Well, this is one of the neighborhoods of eastern Mosul, liberated from Islamic State. Since the anti-terror operation started, locals have been suffering severe shortages of food, water and medical equipment. The soldiers distributing food struggled to contain the crowds. It's been reported that Iraqi security forces even fired gunshots in order to disperse the desperate mass of people. Well, we can be joined live now by Peter Maurer, who's the president of the International Committee of the Red Cross. Thanks for joining us here on RT today. Mr. Maurer, good to have you with us. How would you assess the current humanitarian situation in Aleppo? It's been a month now since that campaign began. In Mosul, apologies, the humanitarian situation in Mosul.
Well, in the whole region, whether we speak of Aleppo, whether we speak of Mosul, ICRC is very much concerned by the unfolding dynamic of violence, of warfare, of the impact of violence and warfare on people in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen and beyond. And of course there are those emblematic situations and battles ongoing at the present moment, like in Mosul, like in Aleppo, and we do our best to respond to the humanitarian crises emerging from this situation. We have pre-positioned our logistics, our staff, our humanitarian goods, and do as best as we can to access people in need and to provide water, sanitation services, food, medical services, just to help people survive in Mosul and in many other places of the region.
Indeed, and just after the US-led coalition in Mosul was launched, it was described as a hybrid war involving obviously many third parties, where the enemy isn't necessarily defined perhaps as a state. There's various different groups here on all sides. Why do you think that's become commonplace? And I mean, what does it actually do to hinder the plight of civilians, having so many actors at play here?
Well, it's a purely mathematical equation also, that the more actors we find in the battlefields, the more armed groups we are confronted with, the more difficult it is to negotiate the humanitarian space. And as you know, ICRC for decades and more than 1.5 centuries now has been committed to negotiate consensually with all parties concerned the humanitarian space. So more actors means more complicated negotiations around a humanitarian space. If these actors are unstructured, it's even more complicated and complex. This is a reality with which we are confronted in today's warfare, be it in the Middle East, but also in other contexts. We have more than 2 actors to negotiate with, and this is of course adding to the complexity of any humanitarian operation today. It's hindering the security for our staff. It's making our lives more complicated, but it's the reality with which we are confronted today.
Indeed. And does your organization have any information or any data about the number of civilian victims killed in various airstrikes around the city of Mosul? Is enough being done to minimize that number?
Well, we don't know about exact numbers. Our first priority is to respond to those people we have access to, we know about, and that's our first preoccupation. We will, as events unfold, we will have more clarity. It is our continued concern in today's battlefields, be them Syria, Iraq again, or Yemen, that in particular in air combat operations, that the precaution and distinction between civilians and militaries are preserved, and this is a continued worry we have and something we engage with all those who are engaged in either artillery warfare or in aerial warfare it's a big challenge today to have those principles of international humanitarian law, of distinguishing between civilians and militaries, respected in those modern forms of warfare. We certainly believe that in all the contexts that we know, more has to be done in order to be closer to respect of those basic principles of humanitarian law.
Indeed, and of course, as you mentioned earlier, just across the border, there's a very serious situation developing in the Syrian city of Aleppo as well. There's accusations on both sides of civilians being hit with shelling, with airstrikes, but on the other hand, Russia has also set up corridors several times for civilians, even militants, to leave the rebel-held east of the city, but people have been stopped from getting out. What else can be done to help those people trapped in that side of Aleppo?
Well, it is one of our big concerns when we have limitations to access, that we need to bring parties together, and we need to reach out to all those in control of territory and civilian populations in order to find the consensual arrangements which allows us to deliver humanitarian assistance and protection services. And it is unfortunate that in many of the conflicts we are observing that the civilian population is taking hostage, basically, of the disagreement between parties to let humanitarian workers, humanitarian organizations like the ICRC do their work. And this happens in many contexts of the region in Syria again, as well as in many other situations. So we will have to engage with all those who have influences on the parties on the ground in order to make their utmost and to use their power and their ability to influence actors, so that these actors recognize the needs of people to get humanitarian assistance. I think at the present moment we don't have sufficient cooperation and sufficient engagement by those who have an influence on all the parties in Syria to nudge the parties of the conflict into better behavior, better respect, more forthcoming engagement with humanitarian actors, but also more concern about the civilian populations, which is the first victim of this conflict.
And just briefly, Mr. Maurer, in terms of the broad overview of the conflict here, obviously it's been going on for 5 years in Syria, in Iraq as well, and any conflict will mean civilian casualties. Whoever is conducting shelling, airstrikes, etc., civilians will suffer ultimately, yet nobody sees any alternative, at least at the moment, to violence to try to stop terrorism. Groups such as ISIS, al-Nusra, etc. How is it possible to help ordinary people in this kind of situation, in this quagmire and cycle of violence?
Well, our starting point is that we shouldn't accept civilian victims in conflict as just a given. We have to do everything we can to minimize those civilian victims. At the end of the day, I agree with you. We cannot avoid warfare which will not eventually have also an impact on civilian people. But I think, again, we need better cooperation, more powerful engagement of all parties to the conflict to create those humanitarian space, to allow civilians to flee to places where they feel more secure. We need to have orderly evacuation routes. We need to have access for humanitarian organizations. We need the militaries and the armed groups to take much more precaution in the use of force. We see with great concerns that today's conflicts are moving to urban areas, to cities where civilians are much more exposed to the impact of explosive, of bombardments, of artillery. And I think there is a lot to do in order to minimize the impact of this warfare, even if we can't avoid. We do not have to accept, and we should never accept, that any victim is just a fatality. It is not. we can do more, and I think it is important that all those who are committed to international humanitarian law, to humanitarianism, do more in order to do the best to protect civilians. It is an absurdity in today's conflict that civilians have become the first and foremost victims of conflict, and the best or the most securest situation in a conflict today is to be a soldier. So this equation has to change again.
Indeed. Peter Maurer, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, thank you for your time today, giving us that update on those situations in Mosul and Aleppo.